A forest so dark and dense, the sun can't find its way through. Two lost children, their hands gripped in fear, wander without a clue. And then, through the trees, they see it, a vision of pure delight. A cottage made not of wood or stone, but of gingerbread, cake, and candy. Inside, an old woman with a smile as sweet as her sugary walls beckons them in. It's a story we've all known since childhood, a cautionary tale whispered into our ears that has fascinated and terrified us for generations. The story of Hansel and Gretel. We all know the famous bits by heart. The trail of breadcrumbs eaten by birds, the little boy locked in a cage to be fattened up, and the cannibalistic witch who plans to cook him in her giant oven. We remember Gretel's quick thinking, the witch's fiery end, and the kids making it home with pockets stuffed with treasure. It's a classic fairy tale, a simple fight between good and evil, a story of survival against all odds. And for centuries, we've accepted it as just that, a story. A dark fantasy invented to teach kids not to wander off or trust strangers. But what if I told you there's more to it than that? What if the villain wasn't some magical witch from a fantasy land, but a real woman? A respected baker from 17th century Germany named Katharina Schraderin. And what if the real story wasn't about her trying to eat children, but about two people named Hans and Grete who allegedly shoved her into an oven, murdered her, and stole everything she owned? For decades, a theory has been floating around that the brothers Grimm didn't just write down a piece of folklore. They accidentally chronicled a real, brutal murder. This is the story of the Hansel and Gretel trial, a look into a supposed crime that has been wrapped in myth. We're going to investigate the case of Katharina Schraderin, look at the evidence, and uncover a tale of jealousy, greed, and a shocking crime that may have been twisted into the fairy tale we all know. Be warned, though, the truth at the end of this trail of breadcrumbs might be stranger and a lot more complicated than you could ever imagine. To understand this supposed true story, we need to go back in time to 17th century Germany, a land gripped by superstition, war, and incredible hardship. In this world lived a woman named Katharina Schraderin. Born in 1618, Katharina was not a hunched-over, warty witch, but an amazingly talented and successful baker. She was famous for her exquisite gingerbread cookies, called Lebkuchen, with a recipe so good, people said it was almost magical. As the story goes, Katharina learned her trade in a monastery, where she was given a secret recipe that made her baking unlike anyone else's. Her skill took her to the busy markets of Nuremberg, a major hub for gingerbread. There, her cookies became the talk of the town, earning her fame and a lot of money. But her success didn't go unnoticed. It caught the eye of a local baker named Hans Metzler. And Metzler wasn't interested in Katharina's charm. He was interested in the secret to her success, her recipe. He tried to woo her, but Katharina was sharp. She saw right through his romantic act and knew it was just a flimsy attempt at corporate espionage. She realized he wanted her recipes, not her, so she turned him down. Hans did not take the rejection well. Eaten up by envy, he started a campaign of harassment against her. His constant persecution, the story claims, eventually drove Katharina out of Nuremberg. Looking for peace, she went back to her hometown but found no rest. Metzler's obsession followed her. To finally get away from him, Katharina left everything behind but her baking tools and her secret recipes. She retreated deep into the remote Spessart forest, a wild woodland far from the politics of the city. There, she built a new life and a new bakery, hidden from the world. But you can't hide that kind of talent forever. Soon, word started to spread about a reclusive baker making heavenly sweets in the forest, and her reputation was reborn. This renewed fame was like a knife in the back for Hans Metzler. His jealousy boiled over into a dark plan. If he couldn't marry his way into her recipe, he would take it by force. He traveled to the town of Gelnhausen and, in 1647, officially denounced Katharina Schraderin as a witch. He accused her of using black magic to make her amazing cookies, claiming she was luring people with her strange food. In an era of rampant witch hunts, that was basically a death sentence. Katharina was arrested, brought before the Inquisition, and branded the Baker Hex, the bakery witch. Even after being repeatedly tortured, a common and brutal practice in witch trials, Katharina never broke. She insisted she was innocent and refused to confess. Her incredible resolve, and maybe some old connections from Nuremberg, actually worked. The court couldn't break her or find any real evidence, so they acquitted her. She was found innocent and set free. Vindicated but no doubt traumatized, Katharina returned to her secluded house in the forest. But Hans Metzler wasn't about to let justice get in his way. His legal attack had failed, so he turned to a much more direct approach. If the law wouldn't give him what he wanted, he'd take it himself. Along with his sister, a 34-year-old woman named Greta, he went into the forest. This time, they weren't there for a trial. They were there to commit murder. The two of them broke into Katharina's home. In the very place she had built as her sanctuary, they killed her. To cover up the crime, they dragged her body to one of her large baking ovens and burned it. A grim ending that sounds eerily familiar. But in a final, bitter twist, their whole gruesome plan was for nothing. They tore the house apart looking for an iron chest that supposedly held her secret recipes. They never found it. The secret to her famous Lebkuchen died with her. Hans and Grete were apparently caught, but the story goes that their version of events, a tale of a wicked, child-eating witch, was somehow believed, and they were let go. Hans Metzler supposedly went on to live a long, prosperous life, his crime forgotten by history, only to be preserved in a twisted way in a children's story. This incredible, detailed story probably would have been forgotten as a local legend if it weren't for a man named George Osseg. The story as we know it today was supposedly dug up in the early 1960s. Osseg, described as a German high school teacher and amateur archaeologist, was obsessed with the Hansel and Gretel fairy tale. He was convinced it was based on a true story and set out to find the real witch's house. His search led him to the Spessart forest. In the summer of 1962, he supposedly hit the jackpot. Deep in the woods, he claimed to have found the ruins of an old stone foundation. His archaeological dig turned up some amazing things. Osseg claimed to have found the skeleton of a woman, which forensic analysis apparently showed had been killed before being burned in an oven. He also unearthed 4 old baking ovens on the site. And then came the final piece of the puzzle. Hidden in the ruins, Osseg found a charred iron box. Inside were old baking tools and, most importantly, a handwritten recipe for Katharina Schraderin's legendary gingerbread. It seemed like the smoking gun. Osseg pieced together Katharina's story from what he called old church and town archives, a trial report he found, and his own forensic work. The story he presented was the one we just heard: a talented baker murdered by her jealous rivals, Hans and Grete Metzler. In 1963, just in time for the 100th anniversary of Jacob Grimm's death, these findings were published in a book titled Die Wahrheit über Hansel und Gretel, * The Truth About Hansel and Gretel Star. The book was a sensation. It was presented as serious, non-fiction historical research. It had maps of the forest, detailed drawings of the dig site, and photos of the artifacts, the ovens, the iron chest, even a copy of the crumbling recipe itself. The German public was hooked. Scholars and everyday people were stunned to learn that one of their most beloved fairy tales was really a sanitized version of a gruesome 17th century murder. For a time, the story of Katharina Schraderin became a widely accepted origin for Hansel and Gretel. It was the perfect true story, dark, tragic, and it completely changed a story everyone thought they knew. It spread around the world, and to this day, it still pops up in articles and videos, presented as the factual basis for the fairy tale. A perfect, shocking story. And that's the problem. It is, Quite literally, too good to be true. Because almost every single detail is a lie. Before we get into that, if you're enjoying this look into the hidden stories behind our most famous myths, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We love digging into these histories, and we want you to be the first to know when we uncover another one. The story of George Osseg and his amazing discovery is a complete fabrication. George Osseg never existed. Katharina Schraderin is not a real person. Hans and Grete Metzler did not murder a baker in the Spessart forest. The entire, detailed story, the dig, the trial documents, the secret recipe, was a brilliantly executed hoax. The book, The Truth About Hansel and Gretel, wasn't written by a teacher. It was written by Hans Traxler, a famous German writer, cartoonist, and satirist. In 1963, Traxler saw a trend of popular, sensational books claiming to have found the true origins of ancient myths. He decided to parody them by creating the most convincing and thoroughly documented historical hoax he could dream up, and he chose Germany's most famous fairy tale as his target. Traxler's commitment to the prank was incredible. The archaeological evidence was all staged. The photos in the book were carefully crafted fakes. The ruins of Katharina's house were just a random pile of old stones. Those ancient baking utensils he found. He later admitted he stole them from his daughter's dollhouse. The radiocarbon dating equipment shown in one photo was actually just a lasagna pan, TV cables, and some spice jars. And the centerpiece of the whole thing, the secret gingerbread recipe that cost Katharina her life? Traxler had copied it from a popular Dr. Oetker cookbook. He even created the character of George Osseg, having photos taken of himself in disguise to serve as the author's headshot. He made up sources, like the trial documents from Gelnhausen, that sounded just plausible enough to be real. Traxler's satire was so perfect, so detailed, that he fooled almost everyone. Major news outlets at the time reported on the findings as fact. The publisher got tons of letters from readers, some of whom were so invested they tried to file fraud complaints against Traxler after he revealed the hoax in 1964. But even after Traxler came clean, the story of Katharina Schraderin had already taken on a life of its own. It was just too good to let go. The idea that Hansel and Gretel were the villains and the witch was their innocent victim was a twist people wanted to believe. And so, it has survived for over 60 years, circulating online as a piece of fiction masquerading as history. It's become a modern folktale in its own right. Proof that a good story can sometimes be more powerful than the truth. So, if Katharina Schraderin isn't real, are we back at square one? Is Hansel and Gretel just a fairy tale? Not exactly. Because while that specific story was a hoax, the original fairy tale is rooted in a historical reality far darker than a made-up murder over a gingerbread recipe. The real historical seeds of Hansel and Gretel are buried in the horrors of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. This wasn't just a time of hunger. It was a catastrophic period of climate change and mass starvation that wrecked much of Europe. Historical records from the time paint a grim picture of a society on the verge of collapse. People ate seeds, roots, even their own dogs. There are even horrifying accounts of cannibalism. In this desperate world, one of the most agonizing choices for parents was what to do with their children. Child abandonment became a terrifyingly real survival tactic. When a family had nothing left, taking children deep into the forest to fend for themselves was seen as a grim alternative to watching them starve to death at home. The core of the story, children abandoned in the woods because of starvation, wasn't fantasy. It was a reflection of a real, collective trauma. In fact, in the earliest versions of the tale, it was both parents who decided to leave the children. The Grimm brothers later changed the character to a stepmother to soften the blow and preserve the ideal of parental love. And what about the witch? The child-eating witch in the woods wasn't new to this story. She's an archetype that's deeply rooted in European folklore, a bogeyman figure used for centuries to scare children into behaving. But this monster was given a terrifying new relevance during the brutal witch hunts that swept across Europe, peaking between the 1500s and 1700s. Germany was the epicenter of this craze, responsible for an estimated 40,000 executions, most of them women. These trials were often fueled by social and economic anxiety. When famine or plague struck, people looked for a scapegoat, and witches were the perfect target. The accusations against them were often projections of a community's deepest fears. And one of the most common and horrifying accusations was cannibalism, specifically murdering and eating children. The famous witch hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, explicitly listed child eating as a primary crime of witches, cementing this link in the public's mind. The witch in Hansel and Gretel is a perfect mix of these historical fears. She lives alone in the forest, a place of real danger and abandonment. Her house, made of sweets, is a cruel trap in a world defined by starvation. And her goal, to cook and eat the children, is a direct echo of the accusations made during the witch trials. She represents famine, fear, and folk justice all rolled into one. The oven, which was the fake murder weapon in the Katharina Schraderin hoax, is how the witch dies in the fairy tale. But in real life, accused witches often faced a similar fate, being burned at the stake. So where does that leave us? We started with a familiar fairy tale. We followed the breadcrumbs to what looked like a shocking true crime, the murder of a baker named Katharina Schraderin. We looked at the detailed evidence from a researcher who seemed to have cracked the case. And then, we found out the whole thing was a masterful hoax, a brilliant satire by Hans Traxler that has become a legend of its own. But pulling back the curtain on that lie led us to a much deeper truth. Hansel and Gretel isn't based on one specific crime, but on the widespread horrors of an entire era. It's a story born from the real trauma of famine, when parents made unthinkable choices and the forest was where children were left to die. It's a story shaped by the paranoia of the witch hunts, where vulnerable women were blamed for society's problems and accused of monstrous crimes. The tale has lasted so long not because it's about one witch, but because it taps into timeless human fears, starvation, abandonment, and the danger of trusting something that looks too good to be true. The hoax of Katharina Schraderin sticks around for a similar reason. We love the idea of a secret history, a dark truth hiding just under the surface of a story we know. It shows how easily fiction can be dressed up as fact and how much we want to believe it. If you thought the tale of children shoving a woman into an oven was horrifying, wait until you hear about the emperor who made death itself into a circus. A ruler who sat on a golden throne and laughed as prisoners were thrown to lions for sport. Click the link above to witness the reign of terror of the emperor who fed prisoners to lions for sport.